Welcome to the King's Table, a podcast out of King's Hill Church in Boston, where we seek to elevate the Bible over opinion, answering the questions you have. I'm your host, Jonathan Mosley. Today we have a special guest with us, Sam Allbery, a writer for the Gospel Coalition and Desiring God. He's also the author of the book, The 7 Myths of Singleness. Now, as a church, we've recently gone through a series on God's design for marriage, sex, and singleness, and we fielded questions from our church. So today's topic is singleness for God's glory. Enjoy. Sam, thanks again for coming on our podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you again.
Sam, a few years back, you came to Boston and you spoke at a conference specifically about singleness and living with God's glory in mind. And, people in our church, they still talk about that. And they just left really encouraged. And because we have so many singles in our church, and I think we always will, just being in the city, I want them to see the beauty of singleness and God's design for it. So thanks for coming on and being part of this conversation. How would you speak into this idea that life is like the game, right? It's level based. The expectation is after high school, you level up and you go to college, and then you level up and then you get married and so forth. And I think this can often lead into thinking that singleness is somehow inferior to marriage because you're not on the same level. What's wrong with that? How would you speak into that?
Yeah, that's a really widespread view. You kind of graduate out of singleness. You unlock the next level called marriage. It's very common for people to think that way. And there are various cultural reasons why people do. And obviously, in the Bible, I think it's fair to say marriage is probably the norm. That's the general expectation. It's part of God's design for how we, work as society and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, in the Bible, marriage is set alongside singleness as being, both of them being gifts of God. And it's not that one is, better than the other one. In fact, Paul comes, he seems to suggest in 1 Corinthians 7, there are ways in which singleness is better than marriage, in terms of helping us be more able to focus on the Lord in a less kind of conflicted sort of way than if we're married and have kids and lots of other things like that. So the fact that Paul commends singleness so highly and says that there's a part of him that wishes all were single like he was, should, I hope, guard us against thinking marriage is superior to singleness, or that it's more, it's a sign that you've progressed further in your Christian life than people who are single. Otherwise, we're actually saying Paul is kind of still, in second grade or whatever it is in his Christianity, and let us not forget Jesus was single. And so what we say about singleness and single people, we need to realize we're speaking about Paul and Jesus. And if I've understood the Bible rightly, Jesus was the most fully human and complete person who ever lived, and was so without being married. So if we imply marriage is necessary to leading a full life, then actually we're actually saying Jesus was less than fully human, and we don't want to go there. So the Bible has just a very different understanding of singleness to what we often have. And if we make it so that singleness is the thing that you progress out of as you advance in the Christian life, then we've really misunderstood the New Testament. It's a good thing. I mean, we rejoice and celebrate when people get married, and there's reasons we rejoice and celebrate, but we're not rejoicing that they've gone into something better than singleness. We rejoice that God has given them this gift of marriage.
Yeah, it's really wise. In Boston, we deal with a lot of students and young professionals, and I'm getting the impression as I'm talking with some that marriage really is, finding a spouse is just the forefront of their minds. And how on one hand can we affirm the goodness of that desire, while at the same time helping tamper that desire so it's not all consuming, right? How can we encourage them to find contentment when desires might be unfulfilled?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, marriage is a good thing. God has designed human sexuality to be expressed physically within marriage. It's always good for us to remember that God has put sexual energy into us because it was His idea to. This wasn't something we discovered, apart from God or behind His back or anything like that. So it's therefore it's natural to feel those emotional and sexual drives kicking in, however fallen they may be as we experience them. And it's natural, therefore, to desire marriage. But I think as we do so, we just need to make sure that we are being realistic and rounded in our understanding of what marriage is. Because sometimes we desire marriage because we've got a very romanticized idea of what it looks like and what it must be like. We think, oh, if I was married, that would be the answer to all of my problems in life. And really what is going on, and Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 7, when you get married, you're entering into this wonderful gift of God called marriage. You are also taking on board a new set of challenges and a new set of pains and trials. Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 7 about how those who are married have many trials and burdens, and he says, and I would spare you this. Now, that's not the only thing Paul says about marriage. He says the most beautiful things we have in the Bible about marriage. But he does know that marriage involves particular heartaches and particular challenges too. So we need to just make sure our desires are based on a kind of realistic understanding of both marriage and singleness, rather than just thinking the mistake I think we often make is that we compare the ups of marriage to the downs of singleness. Mm-hmm. And we forget that there are downs of marriage and there are ups of singleness. And so it's easy to think, well, the grass is greener over there, and not to realize if we get over there, we might start thinking, actually, singleness was kind of a bit easier in certain ways than marriage seems to be. So if we find we have those desires and we're not having a chance to fulfill them, be they romantic or sexual or marital, one of the things that helps me is to realize that those desires in the first place are a signpost to deeper desires we have for completion and intimacy that we ultimately find only in Christ Himself. So those desires are breadcrumbs pointing to the bigger desire and the bigger fulfillment those desires have in Jesus. So if I feel myself with sexual longings, with romantic longings that it's not possible for me to fulfill in this life, one of the things I tell myself is this is my body's way of reminding me that actually I've been created to know my Creator, and that Jesus is the bridegroom and His people are the bride. And the deepest union we can ever experience, the greatest consummation we will ever know, is that one spirit relationship we have with Jesus, and which we will have in its fullness for all of eternity. So it's like you're in a restaurant, you are really, really hungry, you haven't eaten all day, you're already smelling the food and saliva is pouring out of your mouth in all kinds of embarrassing ways. And some people on your table are receiving appetizers, and you're like, I need that. But you also know that in 7 minutes time they're going to be bringing in the entrees, and you're like, do you know what, I can wait for the entree. And if our life in Christ is the real marriage, the real fulfillment, the real satisfaction, yeah, there's some longings and there's pain when longings go unmet, but they're going unmet for a temporary season until I get the even better thing, which is what those, what earthly marriage is ultimately pointing to, which is life with Christ.
Yeah. In our one thing that you said there that you said a lot of incredible stuff just now, but one thing that you said that just stood out to me is when those desires are unfulfilled, one thing you tell yourself. And I think back to the past podcast we did about temptation, and then in this case, dealing with unfulfilled desires. What are we telling ourselves? And just what you just shared in those 3 minutes or so, just the truth about what awaits us as believers, this future glory that we're going to experience. And someone might say, like, that's gospeling the heart, like talking the gospel to the temptation or to the unfulfilled desires. And man, I love what you unpacked there. One of my favorite lines, and I think this is a great connection to what you just shared. One of my favorite lines from your book, The 7 Myths of Singleness. I did get it right. It is 7, right? You did.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to make sure. Something you said was marriage shows us the shape of the gospel, and singleness shows us the sufficiency of the gospel. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so one of the things we see about marriage in the Bible is that it doesn't just happen to be this human phenomenon we've stumbled into. It's something God has embedded into all human societies. And one of the reasons for that is not just, his intended way for us to have kids and to raise them, but actually to be a signpost to the big thing he is doing in the universe, which is making a people for his son, Jesus Christ. And we see this in lots of places in the Bible where God is spoken of as a bridegroom, where his people are spoken of as his bride, often in the Old Testament, sadly, as his wayward bride. And then in a place like Ephesians 5, Paul is giving instructions and guidance to husbands and wives, and he just then says, actually, this is really about Christ and the church. This is what marriage is ultimately about. It's meant to be a picture of the covenant love Jesus gives to his people and how they respond to that love and are faithful to him. So in that sense, marriage is meant to show us the shape of the gospel. We enact something of the gospel at every kind of traditional, typical wedding service where you've got a groom who's gone ahead and is waiting for the bride, who then arrives in all her splendor, and then they pledge themselves to one another exclusively. She takes his name and goes off to be one with him. That is a picture of what Christ has done for us. Mm. So marriage shows us that the shape of the gospel in that way. Singleness shows us the sufficiency of the gospel, because it's saying, given all of that, if we have Christ, we have what is ultimate. And marriage, if it is pointing to Christ in the church, however rightly we honor marriage and revere it, it isn't ultimate if its job is to point to the thing that is ultimate. And therefore, singleness is a way of saying that our life with Christ, and that the perfect life we will have with Christ in the age to come, is so real and so good that we can live even now fully in Christ as an anticipation of how we will be then. Jesus says that in the age to come, we won't marry or be given in marriage. We won't have human marriage in the age to come, because we will have the reality that marriage was always meant to be a signpost to. And so singleness is a way of saying that reality is sufficient, such that actually I can live in the light of it now. It doesn't mean it's always easy, just as, in fact, marriage isn't always easy. But it means that if I have Christ, I have enough. I have the one who calls himself the bridegroom.
Sam, in your book, you mentioned that one of the myths of singleness is believing that singleness is a special calling. You said that's a myth that is not true. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, singleness is special in the sense that singleness itself is a gift, but I think one of the mistakes we've made is we've come up with this category called are you called to be single? And we sometimes use the word gift in that respect and say, do you have the gift of singleness, by which we mean some special calling on your life to be single. And I've called that a myth simply because I don't think that's how Paul speaks of singleness as a gift at all. He's using gift to mean the state of being single, not how you may happen to feel about that state. The problem with it is, if we say that some people have the special calling, the special gift of being single, again, it's implying that singleness in and of itself requires some spiritual superpower in order to be able to truly flourish within it. And it's another way of saying singleness just isn't that great, because the only way you can really hang in there is if you've got some special calling to do so. It's like, do you have a calling to go and live in the middle of the desert somewhere? It would take a calling for you to be able to do that, because everyone recognizes that's not the best way to live for everybody else. So we just need to make sure we don't unwittingly demean singleness by speaking in those kinds of terms. And if you were to be consistent with that language, you would end up having people who are married saying, "Well, I know I'm married, but it's kind of hard work. I didn't realise that. I'm not sure I have the gift of being married." And then you open up all kinds of cans of worms, and it's just not the way Paul is using the language of calling or the language of gifting. Marriage and singleness each are gifts. They're each manifestations of the goodness of God in our lives. So whichever we happen to find ourselves being, we're not missing out on the goodness of God.
So I have three girls, and so I've really been trying to take in biographies of women missionaries. And so I just finished a book called Becoming Elizabeth Elliot. I think it's a rather new book, but just kind of tracking through her life, she brings up this point you're talking about, the gift being something that God assigns. And so she was single for a long time, and even dating her first husband, Jim. There was years long process of courting, but she sensed that in her courting, being single, that was a gift. And then when she was married, that was a gift, even though the marriage was a really short time period. And then many of us know the story that Jim was speared to death. And then she became a widow, and she considered that a gift. The widowhood, the being married, the being single, all of it was what God had assigned. And so it wasn't a special calling in the sense that I had to feel called to it. This was just what God had assigned to her life. And now in this assignment, how can I be used and how can I know him? And so I just love, you making that point in your book. And, as we think about, if God has assigned us to singleness, that being a gift, what does a God-sized vision for singleness look like? And what opportunities do singles have, both in experiencing God's presence and in being used for his kingdom?
Yeah, I love that question. Both marriage and singleness are gifts given by God to us, not merely to make us feel fulfilled, but in order for us, as you say, to know him and to serve him and to be a blessing to others. So if we're married, our marriage doesn't exist for our sake. It partly exists for the sake of others. How can our marriage be a blessing to others? How can it be a means of serving others? And the same is true of singleness. It's easy to take singleness and to think, well, this is great. I don't have responsibilities to other people. I can do what I want to do when I want to do it. I can be, just live for me. But God gives the gift of singleness for the sake of serving. And so in as much as it gives me more flexibility and freedom, it's in order that I use that flexibility and freedom for the kingdom. So Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 7 about being able to serve the Lord in a way that is with undivided devotion. That's the language he uses. Again, he's not saying singleness is more spiritual than marriage. He's just being realistic that actually marriage pulls you in a ton of directions all at the same time. And as if you're single, you have a kind of a focus and a capacity and a lack of complexity that actually means you can serve in a very there are certain ways you can serve that married people can't. So the right question to ask is, as a single person in the situation that I'm in with the various opportunities I have, what is the most I can do for the kingdom with this singleness? And in particular, are there things I can be doing for the kingdom that just would not be possible if I was not single, and that perhaps my married friends are not going to be able to do? I mean, that would seem to me to be one of the main things to then focus on, is what can I uniquely do with my singleness that will serve God's kingdom? And that will look different from person to person. Some people are, I think of people I know who are single parents, and obviously singleness, if you're a single parent, is very different to singleness if you don't have kids. The freedoms are different. But for someone in my situation who is not married, doesn't have dependents in the same way, there's any number of things that I can do for Christ and for his people that just wouldn't be possible if I was married, or at least wouldn't be probably wise if I was married.
Sam, thanks so much for just helping us get a God-sized vision for singleness. And I love what you shared, especially what singleness communicates and showing the sufficiency of the gospel, but also the unique opportunities that can present itself both in knowing him and serving him. So Sam, thanks for the time that you've given us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us at the King's Table. I hope you found this conversation with Sam Allberry fruitful and helpful. If you'd like more information or resources from Kings Hill Church, you can visit us online at www.kingshillboston.com.